Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. Sometimes life hands us circumstances, situations, if you will, and the answers that we have to resolve the problem leave a lot to be desired. If you'll forgive my English, it's a case of worse or worser. And sometimes we have to choose the least worst answer. In 1 Kings chapter 17, we have encountered a prophet by the name of Elijah. Elijah has called down a famine on the land of Israel because of King Ahab's sin. Now, the problem with calling down a famine, or rather a drought that will result in a famine, where you live is that you have to live with the fallout. And that's exactly what happens. So we find Elijah living in a ravine, drinking from the brook, and God is providing food with ravens. They're flying the food in, call it airmail, if you will, each day. But to add insult to injury, eventually the brook runs dry, and now he has nothing to drink. And God speaks to him and says, go to Zarephath. I have a widow woman there that I have spoken to. She's going to take care of you. So in obedience to God, Elijah picks himself up and heads to Zarephath. And he finds a woman gathering sticks to build a fire, and he comes up and says, would you make me a meal? She looks at him and explains to him her crisis. She says, I have a little bit of flour, a little bit of oil. I'm going to make some cakes for my son and I. This will be our very last meal that we have food for, and then we're going to start dying. And then she's presented with a worse or worser choice. Because Elijah says, well, look, I still need you to make something from me. And then he gives her the kicker. He says, if you'll do that, the jar of flour will never run empty, and the jug of oil will never run dry until this famine is broken. Well, she chooses that route, makes him the meal, and begins to see his prophecy come to pass. When you see prophecies come to pass, it's faith building. Not too long after that, her son gets sick, and he dies. And she goes to Elijah and says, how could you let this happen to me? And Elijah prays for the young man, and God heals him. And then she says, now I know that you speak the true word of God, that you're a true prophet. From her worse or worser situation, God's grace, God's miraculous power begins to build her faith. And ultimately, her next crisis produces faith. She's not alone in that circumstance. Think of Moses and the Israelites. They're fleeing Egypt, and now they're smack up against the Red Sea. The Egyptians are chasing them with their army, and they have two choices: swim or fight. Neither one of those are very good. So they turn to their leader, Moses. Moses turns to God. God tells Moses to stretch out his staff. God splits the Red Sea, and they cross over on dry land. Again, a crisis produces faith. Think, if you will, about the Apostle Paul. He knew the law backwards and forwards. He enforced the law with great rigidity. In fact, even to the point of putting Christians in prison and killing them if he could for violating the Jewish law and proclaiming that Jesus was Messiah. And then one day he had his own crisis of faith. And when Jesus knocked him off of that donkey and began to speak to him, he realized that the grace of God overwhelmed the law. And he changed his life dramatically and drastically and impacted much of Asia and Europe for the rest of his life. In John chapter 14, we find a different story. Jesus is teaching the disciples about heaven, telling them he's going to go to heaven, prepare a place for them. And they can't quite grasp this. And it's not that they're calling him a liar, it's just that they're not ready to let him go. They're not quite sure they understand all of this heaven stuff. Then one of the disciples says, show us the Father. That'll be enough. That'll build our faith. Let us see God, and then we'll believe you. And Jesus then begins to talk about faith. He says, if you've seen me, have seen the Father, because the Father and I are one. And if you'll have faith in me, you can ask what you will, ask anything in my name, and it will be granted to you. And this brings us back full cycle, I'm afraid, to where we started. We will all experience crises in our life, the stuff of life that happens. Whether we're a widow woman with our last meal because she had no social services, she had no safety net, she had no family. Perhaps you've been there, you've lost your job, and you've got no income, and the unemployment hasn't started, and you don't know how you're going to pay the rent or put food on the table. There are all sorts of crises I could describe. But the thread that runs through all of them is this. As believers, we're called to exercise faith. Sometimes I've been in a place where I just didn't have much faith. I really didn't. I didn't know if I could trust God. And I hate to say that because God has been phenomenally gracious in my life over the years. Sometimes I've been like the father that brought his son to the disciples while Jesus is up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John. And when he comes down, the father says the demon in him throws him into the fire and throws him into the water and tries to kill him. And your disciples couldn't do anything. Can you do anything? And Jesus says, you have to have faith. And he says, I got faith. I just need you to help my unbelief. I've been there a few times. But here's what I've experienced. If I can make the right decision in those crisis times, even if I'm not sure, I may be making a faith statement without having the faith underlying it, but I make the right decision, that is to trust God. Then as he steps into the situation, and he has done that more times than I can account for, it builds my faith and prepares me for the next time. Our widow woman saw not only the jug of oil and the jar of flour continue to provide for them throughout the famine, she saw her dead son returned to her alive. The Israelites not only saw God intervene on their part and split the Red Sea, they watched him destroy the Egyptian army at the same time. Paul, known as Saul at the time, not only realized the error of his ways as a legalist, as a Pharisee, but very quickly he began to see God doing miracles through his ministry, and doing some phenomenal things that never would have happened otherwise. So here's the thought I want to leave with you tonight. We're called to have faith. Maybe it's as small as a mustard seed. But Jesus says, I can work with that. And if we'll have that trust in him and realize he is not the least worst option, he's the best option. We may not understand it. We may not be able to explain it. I frequently have not been able to. But when God steps in, it doesn't matter anymore, really, does it? Because God's at work in our lives. And that is faith building all by itself. So tonight I want to leave you with this thought. A walk of faith can be difficult. It forces us into making hard choices and decisions sometimes. But we're doing it with a God who says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. And that choice to operate in faith, even though we're not quite sure why we're doing it, will never be the wrong one. And now, while I'm thinking about it, we will not meet next week in the pastor study. My wife and I are leaving on vacation next Wednesday. We'll be gone for 2 weeks, but we'll be leaving on Wednesday and probably returning on Wednesday 2 weeks later, which says that we will most likely not have a pastor study for 3 weeks. I'll look forward to seeing you when I get back. Be blessed. Be greatly blessed by the